President Erdogan wants to come to the White House. We have a very good relationship. The ceasefire has held very nicely. We've kept the oil. We stayed back and kept the oil. Other people can patrol the border of Syria, frankly, and Turkey. Let them. They've been fighting for 1,000 years. Let them do the border. We don't want to do that. We want to bring our soldiers home. But we did leave soldiers because we're keeping the oil. I like oil. We're keeping the oil, and we're working with the Kurds, and we're frankly working with Turkey, and we're working with a lot of countries. We had a tremendous victory the other day in getting the #1 terrorist in the world, and probably one of the maybe the #1 terrorist for the last 50 years, and we knocked him out, and then we knocked out #2, and we already have #3 in our sights. Well, we're moving along with the deal with China. China wants to make the deal very much, and we have a good relationship, and we'll see what happens. I don't like to talk about deals until they happen, but we're making a lot of progress. Looking at a different couple of locations.
Like?
It could even be in Iowa. Could be in Iowa.
Mr. President,
Tried that one. You understand? Could be.
Mr. President, a quick question.
I mean, it's something we are discussing, but we're discussing location. But I like to get deals done first.
U.S. for sure, though, sir?
Singapore. I would do it in the U.S.
You would do it in the U.S., and she would too?
He would too.
Okay, Mar-a-Lago, maybe?
We're thinking about Iowa.
Where in Iowa?
We have to get I want to get the deal done first. But we're thinking about Iowa. You know why? Because it would be the largest order in history for farmers. So to me, Iowa makes sense. I love Iowa. It's a possibility.
As ordered, Trump helped Russia increase oil production. Moscow, Nov 3, RIA Novosti, Natalia Dembinskaya. Venezuela and Iran suffered the most from US oil restrictions, where daily production fell by almost 3 million barrels. With Russia, everything turned out the other way around. Production increased to 10.7 million barrels per day. How it turned out that Washington as sanctions came to hand in Moscow, RIA Novosti reports. Inverse effect. Olga Lebedinskaya, an assistant professor at the economics department of the Russian Economic University named after G.V. Plekhanov, calculated that 1/3 of the world's oil reserves and 1/5 of production are under US sanctions. She explains that world oil reserves are 1.66 trillion barrels, of which 298.4 billion are in Venezuela, 157.8 billion in Iran, and 80 billion in Russia. If you add up the oil resources in these countries, their share will be 51% of the top 30 countries' leaders in reserves and almost 33% of global reserves. When Qatar enters the sanctions list, which left OPEC in 2018 and supports Iran, this figure will reach 34%, said Lebedinskaya. The worst sanctions hit Venezuela. Daily production fell 3.3 times, to 0.75 million barrels. If the country mined 2.82 million in 2015, it would now be in 8th place, Lebedinskaya comments. Iran's losses are less, 2.1 million barrels are being produced there so far. As for Russia, the result was the opposite. Production rose to 10.7 million barrels per day. As noted by Oleg Bogdanov, a leading analyst at the QBB investment company, direct oil sanctions, according to the Iranian model, were not introduced against Russia. If this happened, world oil prices would soar above $100 per barrel. Yes, and it is impossible to do this, since the main consumer of our oil is Europe. Europeans cannot refuse our raw materials, as this will cause serious economic problems, rising inflation, higher rates and, ultimately, a recession, the analyst said. Back in 2017, 3 years after the imposition of sanctions, the American The Wall Street Journal admitted the restrictions did not have a significant impact on the Russian oil industry. Moscow continued to introduce new technologies in the energy sector and increased production. This was facilitated by large-scale investments of previous years, significant tax benefits for oil companies and the devaluation of the ruble. The development of new deposits has begun. Novoprovsky, Mesiaksy, Yarisky, Perazlamno, Filanovsky, Trebs and Titov. These projects more than compensated for the decline in production in the fields of Western Siberia, which have been operating since the times of the Ussur. Powerful influence. Experts do not see anything surprising in all of this. Firstly, Russia is much larger than Iran, and even more so Venezuela. In terms of foreign policy and economic influence on the world, Tehran and Caracas are also far from Moscow. Secondly, many countries and regions depend on Russian oil supplies. This applies primarily to the European Union and China, which import huge volumes of raw materials from Russia. Accordingly, they simply do not pay attention to our sanctions. After all, without oil, the Chinese and EU economies will be paralyzed. As a result, a decrease in production in Iran and Venezuela led to an increase in demand for Russian oil, explains industry expert Leonid Kazanov. Indeed, our sanctions have caused a boom in demand for Russian raw materials, including from the states themselves, since the market experienced an acute shortage of heavy sulfurous oil. The point is not only to reduce supplies from Iran and Venezuela, but also that the rest of the exporters, fulfilling the OPEC agreement, reduced primarily the production of heavy grades in order to preserve the export of more expensive light oil. According to Refinitiv Icon, from October to March, Saudi Arabia reduced its exports of sulfur species to Europe by almost half, Iraq by more than 40%, from 615,000 barrels per day to 355,000. Given the inaccessibility of Iranian and Venezuelan raw materials, this led to the fact that European refineries focused on processing heavy grades lined up for the Russian sour Urals. The main victims of Trump's oil sanctions are American refiners. By April, exports from Venezuela to the United States fell by 4.5 times compared with the same period last year, to 139,000 barrels per day. And after the embargo entered into force on April 28, supplies ceased altogether. The oil refineries in the Gulf of Mexico and the US East Coast, designed to process heavy sulfurous oil, were faced with the prospect of a shutdown. As a result, all the largest American companies, Citgo Petroleum, Valero Energy, Chevron, increased purchases of Russian raw materials to record volumes.